My name is Lisa Nisenson. I'm an urban designer who specializes in the intersection of urban design, transportation, and economic development.
I'm Katie Cristol. I'm the chair of the Arlington County Board.
Hello, I'm Michael Shea. I'm an economist with more than 30 years worth of experience working on economic development issues. Please join us in conversation. I feel like in Arlington we're at an interesting place because we've been identified in very broad terms as a suburban county forever, with an urban corridor. But I feel like we're reaching a point where we could be becoming an urban county that has suburban pockets or suburban areas. And that can be a hard transition, and that's not a transition that a lot of other communities have gone through, certainly in the recent past. So I was wondering from each of you, because you both are looking at it from different perspectives, but what you see as, is that happening, and what can we do to make sure that as change happens, it's change we want?
Well, I think that you hit the nail on the head, and a lot of that urban and suburban mixture is actually very grounded in policy and history, where we decided we were going to actually line several corridors with metro capacity. With the densest development, we would taper down to the single-family neighborhoods, and we would kind of put an urban growth boundary and not let that development jump across. That has served us well for 50-some years, but I think there's a lot of people now who are re-examining whether or not there's opportunities where we could actually meet some demands of the future while keeping a lifestyle in all of our neighborhoods where you have choice and where you've got a high quality of life.
And that taper is a very steep taper, typically.
It can be.
For a lot of these neighborhoods, right?
Sure. You know, Michael, one of the things I remember learning when I was in graduate school that really struck me, there's not really a formal definition that we keep in this county about urban, rural, suburban. Right. There's no certain population density per square acre or per acre that you reach that means you're officially urban. And I think that actually really means that those issues, urban, suburban, how dense, a lot of those are in the eye of the beholder. And that's something that I think Lisa really indicated compellingly, right? This question of whether we are urban is going to feel very different to somebody who lives in a single-family house surrounded by other single-family houses than someone who lives proximate to the observation deck in Roslyn, for example. And how enthusiastic that person feels about additional units of housing coming to their neighborhood can vary a lot too.
Right. That's a very good point. Lisa, in your work right now, how have you been affecting this, or how do you see this coming about? So
a lot of what I've done in my career is help communities adopt innovation. So this goes back 20 years with transit-oriented development, and my secret is I learned urban design fighting Home Depot and Clarendon. But really our neighborhoods got together and taught ourselves urban planning, and we were actually fighting for more density, not a low density sort of building. So I think a lot of us came to understand it, and Arlington has produced this legion of people who are forefront in the field in transportation, transit-oriented development, Maria Zimmerman, Chris Fornash. I don't want to leave anybody out, but you get the picture. You know, our planning commission is cranks out some very talented people. So it's just, what was the question? I forgot.
Oh, just this big question about how the change is happening.
Oh, okay. So adopting innovation, that's what it was. Sorry about that.
That's right.
So back from that rabbit hole. So a lot of what I learned was just by being in the rooms with the developers and with other stakeholders and seeing what the trade-offs are and the dynamics, and just really looking at the interlinking pieces of what have to go together in the land use, the transportation, the street design, and things like that. I did a lot of work on green infrastructure, and now I'm doing a lot of work on disruptive change. And most of that is smart city technology and helping cities adopt mobility, so like the bird scooters. Actually, a lot of the work I'm doing is skipping way out ahead and seeing if we can adapt new planning models so that we actually, like we did in the 60s, think ahead and then work backwards. And it's like, how do we meet the future in incremental steps? And that's what I'm seeing around the nation. And some of the other cities that are doing this kind of work, they're doing a lot of pilot programs. They're actually working with vendors. They're doing a lot of experimental tactical urbanism type things with their streets, with bike parking, parklets, and things like that. So I think that as Arlington moves forward, we're going to have to adapt the Arlington way to some of these new models of scenario planning and anticipating the future and working with vendors and doing things completely different.
I just like your tangent there about the people on some of the planning commissions.
Right.
It is interesting because we recognize Arlington has this relationship with the federal government, and that's driving the economy, and that's changing. But it's not usually recognized that the other effect of that is a lot of our residents are people who work in policy issues professionally.
Right.
So they can come to an advisory commission and bring that wealth of knowledge.
Right.
And that's a great community asset. That's not going away.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Or grow it themselves, right? Because I think one of the things that's remarkable is that people may not have a background in urban design, but they know what they value about their neighborhood. And when you think about it, right, the fundamental tension of any community that is growing, and as an aside, you hope to be a community that's growing, right? Because there's not an option to preserve everything in amber and keep it exactly the same. If you're not growing, you're in stagnation and decline, right? And I think that's an important thing to establish at the outset. But for any community that's growing, the question becomes, how do we welcome more neighbors and preserve what we love? And the answer to that fundamental tension is good planning, right? So the difference of saying, I'm concerned about a new building coming in, more neighbors coming in, and saying, I'm concerned about light and air and the trees that I love and more cars on the road. Those are the things that we have decades of experience solving for in Arlington, and we have some incredible civic minds, as well as a really top-notch planning professional staff too. The planning is the answer, right? Good urban design is the answer to that fundamental challenge.
So one big thing coming up is Lee Highway redesign. What do you think will probably be different on Lee Highway as a result of we're at a point where we're accepting more urbanism and there's more pressure? So do you think we're going to see something that looks different on Lee Highway than some of our past properties?
I hope we will. And the tools that we'll use to create something different, right, will potentially be changes to our zoning ordinance or the creation of special categories or incentives. Lee Highway is a great example of that ribbon development, right? That strip mall with lots of parking right in front, very shallow. It has gotten us some spectacular local businesses, right? You don't want to knock it. It's the home of District Taco and some fabulous Bangladeshi restaurants, right? But there is a lot of opportunity there. And one of the things we hear often from Lee Highway residents is that they are interested in creating more retail opportunities, more office opportunities, more creative office opportunities for more work share models, which of course, as Lisa talks about, is one of those transformative or disruptive technologies. So I think we will likely see, I don't want to prejudge the outcome of what will be a robust multi-stakeholder planning process, but I think we'll see some real differences in the commercial buildings that you see lining Lee Highway. And then to support that, we'll see some differences in the transportation required, in the streetscapes, the walkable sidewalks, the improved potentially bike lanes. The final piece that I know is going to be a huge part of the conversation, well, not the final, because public facilities, parks, and others will matter a great deal. But one of the other pieces will be housing, and is Lee Highway an opportunity to think a little bit differently? And one of the things I'm so passionate about, I know Lisa is too, and we'll have a chance, I'm sure, to talk about a little bit later, is how do we rethink low-density housing that could introduce some new opportunities for affordability in the county? And so I think if we scope it out right, and I believe that we're committed to doing this, Lee Highway planning process will be an opportunity not just for the band of commercial properties that line Lee Highway, but a few blocks back. Right? How are we rethinking the future of our lower density neighborhoods?
And some of the demographic changes in Arlington right now should, in theory, help us make a transition like that and think about new housing models, because we have a tremendous growth in the millennials.
Yes.
Who generationally view the world a little bit differently and want different amenities and are open to different things. And we have people, and now I'm in this category, aging in place who love Arlington, want to stay in Arlington, and the single-family home that serves them really well for 20, 30 years might not suit them best for aging in place. So
you got it.
But that's just potential.
And how do we give people an opportunity to age in their neighborhood, right? It's aging in the community rather than aging in place. And right now, we have sort of a polarized housing stock might be one way to say it, right? We've got a low-density single-family neighborhood where it's one family or one arrangement per dwelling, and then you've got, perhaps you're looking to downsize. You have the opportunity maybe of a luxury condo in Roslyn, right, or garden apartment somewhere else,
right?
And so there's nothing that allows you to stay in that neighborhood where you raised your kids, where your friends are, if you don't want to live in that single-family house and keep it up. And so that is such a great example. And then again, as you suggested with millennials or others, the number of people living in a traditionally defined Leave It to Beaver nuclear family is dramatically declining, right? So we need housing forms that match people's lifestyles. And that is a big opportunity for us, something that's really missing here.
And within most of the neighborhoods, greater diversity in terms of housing that's available.
Yes.
And that's going to be the hardest to get at.
It will be.
Because it's one thing to push the condos that the millennials want over in Crystal City, but how do you get something like that in Westover?
Well, and I will tell you, so I'm an old millennial myself, right? And I think there's a little bit of a misperception that the older millennials at least want to live in high-rise condos. That's the market that's available to them, honestly. There's very little in the detached housing market.
Right.
Less than, especially newer construction, less than $700,000 or $800,000, right?
Right.
And so, I the first home my husband and I bought was a townhouse, and we bought a slightly larger townhouse, right, as our lives evolved. And I think that's a great example of that missing middle form of housing that's too rare.
Right.
Right.
And so I live in the Clarendon neighborhood, which in the 40s saw duplexes, I lived next door to a triplex, and I never know. And there's a bunch of duplexes on our blocks, and I just, I know that a lot of the new housing stock is very big and very luxury oriented, and sometimes there's maybe two people in these gigantic houses. And if there were a way to figure out how to bring that zoning into some of the neighborhoods, I know that parking is a perennial. If we're going to talk candidly, let's talk about some of the gorillas in the room. So, and parking is an interesting topic with a lot of the new technology. I was just working with a mixed-use developer from Florida, and he goes, "Cut half of my parking." Cut it in half. Just use technology and tell me how to do it. We cut out 9,000 parking spaces. And some of that is going to be these new shared use models. So there is, of course, Zipcar in Arlington. There are new companies like the Envoy in Los Angeles, and they sell fleets to building owners, to individual building owners. So when you move in, you have your own fleet of cars or mopeds or e-bikes, mostly electric cars. And so with our project, we basically cut the second car out of the zoning requirements, which is very outdated and it oversupplied parking to begin with. But think about if we had those sorts of tools in our toolbox that we could offer to a developer and just say, you can cut out half your parking if you do these 5, 6, 7, 8 things.
Well, and Lisa's right on the cutting. I mean, that's sort of the idea of a shared fleet is fascinating, right? That's sort of the next gen maybe of what we already do in Arlington, right? Which is we have a long history of saying we will require you to build less parking, which is very expensive, of course, if you show that you're going to engage in what we call transportation demand management. So to do things like provide Metro cards to your renters or office tenants or others. And so I think as we think about the future of shared use vehicles, that's really the next frontier.
Because in the case of the residential building, once people see a shared vehicle the same way they see other utilities that they're paying for, they'll accept it more readily because they won't be thinking about the cost. And that's what they do now. You think about, I have a late fee every time I bring it back, you worry about that.
Right. And I think for a lot of people, it's more comforting to know that that's my car that I share with the people in my building rather than maybe a car on the street or a rental car that you go to Reagan Airport and pick up or something like that. And then I think the electric bike share that they have in DC, I know that we're going to get that sooner or later. Those things are a game changer in the communities adopting them. They make it easy to go up and down hills. So all of a sudden you can see North Arlington, which kind of sees a lot of the transportation demand management and shared use and transit for other people in the county. All of a sudden it's theirs as well. So you've got that. And then in South Arlington, Superman Hill.
Yes.
Imagine taking a bike up there and with little effort whatsoever.
That's astonishing. I live near there.
Right,
so I can't imagine.
If we can get some jump bicycles over here. I don't work for them or anything, but they are transformational. So if we could get some of those bikes, what we will begin to see, and we're already seeing right now, and this is a cautionary sort of tale, because we've talked about how we do land use, transportation, and land use, and we usually lump streets into like one of those. I think we have to separate out streets for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's our largest land holding. That's right. It's our real estate. And we just treat it for like a single use mainly, moving and storing cars. And, we fight like the Dickens to get the bike share in there. And then there's on-street parking and loading, but that's how we imagine streets. In Australia, they have just adopted a policy to think of streets as link and as place. So it has to be a welcoming sort of place you go, which I think is just fascinating. Yeah. So if we could do that. But that curb lane is becoming a little bit of a conflict zone.
I have been making that joke recently that is the hottest real estate in Arlington these days, is that curb lane. And one of the things, of course, that's really led to that is the transportation network companies, right? The Ubers and the Lyfts. Right. And they're such a good example, and I think of what happens when these disruptive technologies come to an urbanizing or an environment like Arlington. Every one of these innovations has positives and it has negatives, right? That sounds like a pat thing to say, but a great example, the Uber and Lyfts, it has wreaked havoc on our curbside, especially in the hot areas like the Clarendon area on a Friday, Saturday night. On the other side of the coin, talking recently to our police, we've seen the numbers of DUIs drop to nearly zero over the last half decade or so.
Which is a really important thing.
An incredible thing.
Aside from anything else.
Right, and I think that does get a little bit back to planning, right? How do you maximize the benefits and minimize the negative consequences? And so we've recently, for example, gone forth with a pilot in Clarendon about how we're using the curb space, coordinated drop-off points, right? So we're kind of moving towards a hybrid of the TNCs and a bus service almost, right? So that is, again, that's the technique that we have to say, how do we, make sure this continues to be an offering that prevents people from driving drunk, engaging in a horrible, reckless decision, while also allowing pedestrians to be able to walk around Clarendon at night, right? And walk through the curb space.
It's compounded by the rise in the e-commerce. And so the number of deliveries has just skyrocketed. And I think in the past, FedEx they would block lanes and get a ticket, and it was the cost of doing business. Yeah. Right. But now you've got the TNCs, honestly stopping in a travel lane.
They do.
With very little warning to other traffic. Right. And there was a woman recently killed in New York because a car was blocking the bike lane. She had to swerve out and she was hit by a delivery truck.
I worry about that every time I'm on my bike.
Yeah.
But so the e-commerce though is also big benefit because it's a key part of letting people age in place.
Yeah.
If they don't need to have to get out to the store as often, they can stay in that apartment or their house.
Absolutely.
So
everything has these upsides and downsides, right? The good question is how we manage.
I was going to shift a little bit to thinking about workspaces and commercial space and there, because I know in DC they've got some WeWork shared workspaces, and I've been in them. I was working on a video shoot in them, and it wasn't the oldest I felt, but I felt pretty old. I kept seeing this one other guy who had some gray hair, and it's like, hey, these kids. But that is such a different way to work, and it's such a great potential to create the entrepreneurial ecosystem that you want to become known for. That do we need to change our zoning? How do we get there?
Sure, great question. So we do have a number of co-working sites in Arlington, which is very exciting. It's an exciting adaptive reuse for a lot of our older office spaces, right? It's probably no secret to most of the highly engaged viewers of your program, right, that we have a very high office vacancy rate in Arlington, resulting from a number of factors, certainly changes in priorities where the federal government tenants its buildings or where it rents for its offices, also driven by exactly what you were just indicating, a declining per person utilization, companies thinking very differently about how they house their workforce. And so we have a lot of buildings that were really built for the federal workforce of the 60s and 70s. And the question becomes, is if those buildings might come down in another 10 years or 20 years, right, for an overall redevelopment, what do we do with them now while they're vacant? Right. And that's where Arlington can start to think how we get a little bit flexible around the zoning. Sometimes they need to come in for a site plan revision. One of my favorite examples, and something, frankly, I'd love to see more of in Arlington, best I can understand it, I think the financial model has been a little challenging for the developer, which is why we haven't seen more of it. But the we live space, right? So that is the companion to we work, the micro units. And that is, we were talking earlier about how different housing forms support different types of people. Right. And we live is such an amazing model. You go, they're micro units, right? You can rent something that looks more or less like a traditional apartment, or you can rent something that is a bed in what feels like a dorm room. But they have some fabulous amenities. I think the envisioned idea there was that it would be for these tech bros, right, who come and do their startup and just need somewhere to rest their head at night and then work all day. But if you actually go and check out We Live, it is tapped into such a need. You have parents and children who live there. You have a group of senior citizen ladies, for example, who appreciate the opportunity to kind of live among girlfriends, somewhere that's walkable, right? And age in the community. I have talked to parents of young people with developmental disabilities who are fascinated by this micro units model. Make a lot of sense for kind of permanent supportive housing for other populations. So all of that did take, it was a little before my time on the board, but it did take some flexibility, a major site plan amendment. I know a lot of work on the staff's part to figure out how do we make it work within our zoning to convert the use from an office to a residential? These are smaller than our usual residential units, but we have the practice in doing it, and I'm hoping we'll see more.
And I was not a tech bro in my 20s.
You were not? No?
But,
I wasn't ever
a lot of people that are in that time of their life, you get away a lot on weekends. That's what you do. Almost like you have to.
Yeah. And to be able to have a place to live in a major urban area in Arlington, steps from a metro at $900 a month is pretty remarkable. Right.
And it also, and people don't think of it this way, but to have a good entrepreneurial local economy, you don't just need to be able to point to businesses that make it. Yeah. Because a lot of businesses don't. But that churn is totally part of the process. So you need to be a place where you can fail and rebound. So you're not locked into more of an office lease than you need, and you're not locked into housing you can't afford. Right. So I know that people at Arlington Development don't want to talk about all the businesses that do fail in Arlington, but those are important. That's an important part of the evolution.
Our economic development team talks often about trying to create an ecosystem, right? And when you think about a thriving cloud forest, for example, it's everybody from the tiny ferns to the great jungle trees, and some are going to die, right? But they'll spread a seed that might flourish elsewhere, and I think that is really exemplary of what you're saying, right? And concern about it, and concern that I share about communities, towns, states incenting the big fish. What we have a really strong track record of doing in Arlington, the vast majority of the already pretty small number of companies that we incent are more of these startups. These we call them gazelles, fast-growing companies. We're a little more cautious and conservative as government. It's taxpayer investment. We want to know we're going to get that ROI. So we tend to look for the gazelles that have had a little more of a track record. Right, we know we're going to get that return on investment as opposed to a pure first-time startup with no proven track record. But we really have exactly as you've described, because the growing companies in that ecosystem in some ways are almost more important than the mature companies. That's where we've prioritized our resources.
And you still want retention. You still want companies that are going.
Sure, and the schools have done a really good job of establishing these little innovation labs and having competitions where the kids compete for startup funds. And that's really, I wish I had that when I was in high school.
Or the Young Entrepreneurs Academy that the Chamber does.
Right.
But yeah, the high school students, the entrepreneur classes in high school.
But it's such a great skill for our kids, right? When we think about what we want our young people to be able to do, because the idea that we're going to prepare you for a career in biochemical engineering is incredibly important, right? And you'll make a very good wage and contribute well to our economy. But to prepare somebody with the entrepreneurial skill, whatever field they end up going into, right? That's going to be such a cross-cutting ability. So to develop and to inculcate those talents in our young people is such a gift.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I did want to get this point in because there is a role for AIM in the new economy, because I can't tell you how many times an entrepreneur goes out and they have to produce a 2-minute video. Right. So if you have a Kickstarter campaign, you have to have that video. And of course they say, oh, you can do it in your kitchen and let your kids, but there's all sorts of things like pitch decks, coming up with explainer videos. Right. That's purely made for some of the stuff AIM can do. I would love to see AED and AIM pulled together to take that to the next level.
So the AIM is offering classes in iPhone videography. Okay. To help people with that social media presence, because you don't need to necessarily have it look like you had a huge budget for it. Maybe you don't want that, but you need something that's going to stand out. So you need to get it to the next level of professionalism, right? You know some of the tricks,
and that combined with how to put together that 2-minute video, whether it's an application for school or for funds or whatever. I mean, that to me, when I was first bootstrapping, an innovation company, that was a really huge gap.
Right. And sometimes that's filled because you get a partner who's got that, but sometimes you're not. You're not working with a partner. Sometimes you need to pull it up by yourself.
And of course, there are firms that can do it, but for the money. Startups of the startups, and some of them are quite pricey. But I could see AIM actually doing a huge job in helping entrepreneurs do that new media plus economic development plus business development. That would be fabulous.
And so you have been working on a lot of these for a long time. You see the challenges. Are you hopeful that Arlington is going to thrive and urbanize well and will achieve these goals? Are you a hopeful person about this?
I am, just because I think there will always be an army of yes in my backyard types of people who go out and make the case, so that you may have people who oppose a bike lane because we've got to build out our bike network fast. Just because the pressure from the scooters, the pressure from the e-bikes and the e-bike share and all that sort of stuff is coming. So we need to figure out quick build. Like how do we test these? How do we get them in the ground to accommodate not just 2 or 3 modes, but even modes within modes that all have their planning nuances. And there's people right now working on that. So I think you've always got that army of yes in my black EMBs who can actually affordable housing, granny flats. They're out there. Right. That's what makes me hopeful.
And all right, so Katie, you've got to be hopeful. You're on the county board.
I couldn't do this job if I wasn't.
You couldn't do the job, you weren't hopeful. But what specific thing do you think we need to most have a community conversation about in the coming year, let's say?
Absolutely. So we just finished a series of big idea roundtables that actually were exactly about this question: how should Arlington grow? And wanted to keep them pretty broad-based and open-ended. They were the origin was in the sense that there are plenty of opportunities to weigh in on what you think the setback should be for exterior accessory dwellings, or where we should locate the bus fleet, but not enough opportunities to say, how's Arlington growing? Am I excited about that? Am I worried about that? Am I angry about that? And let me talk to some of my neighbors. So we had a series of these conversations. They were fascinating, and it was especially great to see people kind of break out of their own bubbles and talk to people that really disagreed with them. One of my big takeaways was that we have to be more explicit in this focus on equity in Arlington. I think sometimes, and I do consider myself pretty wonky, pretty technocratic, and I think that we believe with a lot of good evidence that building cities that have more housing units, right? That building places around transit-oriented development, that those things generally lead to more equitable outcomes and give people more access to jobs and to the economy. But we have not, I don't think, explicitly made equity a focus of that, right? To say, if we are going to build, for example, or if we're going to revise our zoning ordinance that lets somebody build a fourplex or a set of small cottages where now they can only build a single-family house, is it realistic that those small cottages are going to be priced where a working class person can afford them? And if not, how are we ensuring that all levels of the income spectrum are actually represented? Are we being cognizant of the fact that in terms of racial background and country of origin, this county is less diverse than it was a couple of decades ago? This is a problem spot for Arlington, right? And so being clear not only about issues of housing, but all of the ways in which we are intentionally or not creating a community that feels hospitable to people who come from all over the world, from all different backgrounds, but we've always prided ourselves on being. There has to be a more explicit focus. And that's where I think I really see the work ahead, where I'm excited for us to really dive in and start to say, how do we ask ourselves hard questions about equity with every planning decision we make?